maybe this is not a bad time to see if there are any questions or loose threads or things left hanging that people would like to ask about. And if not, I'll actually probably give you a choice of a couple of directions that I might go in. Yes?
Could I ask a question?
Sure.
In the Christian tradition, we have a tendency to focus on the spiritual and degrade the physical.
Mm-hmm.
In the Jewish tradition, I get the impression that they emphasize the importance of both.
That's very true.
Is there anything we can learn from the Jews in that context?
Yeah, don't make that mistake. It is true that Christianity, and especially the Catholic faith, has much more emphasis on the spiritual. Now let me talk about a couple of things about that. It's actually a great topic because it has tentacles that lead in all kinds of directions. The Jews know they're supposed to perfect the world. That is essentially it's in their calling as Jews. It appears, it seems to appear a number of times in the prophets that they are to be a blessing to the whole world. The whole world is supposed to kind of learn from them. And we know that that's a reference to the Messiah, that they're supposed to perfect the world by bringing the Messiah. But they don't know that it refers, they used to know that it referred to the Messiah, but as they became less intrinsically spiritual, and especially with the Enlightenment, because the Enlightenment had a tremendous effect on Jewish theology, as it did potentially on Christian theology, but the Catholic Church was in principle protected from it by the Holy Spirit and by the existence of dogma. But of course, everybody in the world kind of viewed the world extremely spiritually, right, before the Enlightenment, and that everything was the workings of God and spiritual beings and so forth. And they didn't pay all that much attention to the physical causes of things. And then with the Enlightenment, they kind of threw out the sense that there were spiritual underpinnings to everything, and they only looked at the physical causes. And the Enlightenment was a wonderful thing in a funny kind of way for the Jews. Secularly or socially was a wonderful thing, because it was with the Enlightenment that they were emancipated. Because when Europe was still Christendom, the Jews were literally second-class citizens. They didn't have civil rights. I don't know when they were emancipated in England. I know they were only emancipated in France and Germany. They were emancipated in France partially after the French Revolution. They were only emancipated in Germany in, I believe, the 1860s, 1870s, and they were only emancipated in the Papal States in the 1860s. Before then, they didn't have civil rights. They weren't citizens. They were tolerated.
Cromwell did.
What? Cromwell emancipated them. So the Jews were very sympathetic, so to speak, to the movement of the Enlightenment, because it's what kept them from being seen as sort of the murderers of Christ and put in this very special category, and kind of brought them into the mainstream. And with it, with the Enlightenment, they threw out, except for the very religious Jews like the Hasidim, a lot of that intrinsically spiritual worldview, and that sense of perfecting the world became a secular sense of perfecting the world. And I'll argue that a lot of the worst, when you look at the really horrible social trends, they tend to come from either fallen away Catholics or Jews, right? Like Margaret Sanger of Planned Parenthood was a fallen away Catholic. The woman who got religion eliminated from all the schools in the United States was a fallen away Catholic. Karl Marx, of course, was a Jew. The Bolsheviks were largely Jews. These very destructive social movements, I think, tend to come from either fallen away Catholics or Jews. I think that's an illustration of that principle that the corruption of the best is the worst, and that these people who are given particular gifts by God and by the Holy Spirit, when they go astray, those gifts become particularly destructive. But I will argue that those social movements, those really bad social movements that come from the Jews, are a misguided expression of that messianic impulse. And they think that they are supposed to perfect the world they feel they're supposed to perfect the world because that's the messianic impulse in the Jew. And when they don't channel it in a spiritual direction, they channel it in a kind of social, secular direction, and that becomes very easily, essentially, Marxism, communism, God forbid, one world government. Let's do something. The world needs to be perfected, and it's up to us to do it, rather than basically that the prince of this world. I think this is kind of the Catholic view that you're alluding to. Jesus said, right? If you were the world would love you, but you're not of the world, and it hates you as it hated me before it hated you, because we know who the prince of this world is, and the prince of this world isn't God. In other words, we're in a fallen world, and Jesus called the devil the prince of this world, and so. Obviously, the Catholic view is that the perfection of the world comes first and foremost from the sanctification. In other words, you sanctify your soul, right? You become a saint. And when you become a saint, you can do more than anybody else to perfect life on earth. But even then, you will be in this world, but are of this world. Because this world is in some sense, it's a testing ground that is, to a large extent, under the influence of the enemy, who is there to provide this challenge for our sanctification. That's not at all the Jewish view. The Jewish view is that God created the world to be perfect. He wanted the world to be perfect. And every Jew has this fragment of the Holy Spirit with which he should work to perfect the world. I don't know if that's really an answer, but it's kind of, I don't know. I don't know if there was something else that what you said reminded me of, but I've forgotten now.
Roy, would you share with us how the Lord led you into this work?
Oh yeah, sure. Which is essentially where the book came from. Maybe when I tell the story, the last 3 copies will sell. I had these experiences. The experiences that I mentioned. The first experience took place in '87, and the experience of the Blessed Virgin Mary took place in '88. And at that point I was in agony, right? Because what am I supposed to do with my life? Obviously God has some plan for me, or I'm supposed to do something. What is it? And I had no idea what it was. And I spent a lot of time in religious community, not a lot of time, but I kept visiting the Carthusians. I spent a lot of time with another religious order, visiting continually, not ever entering postulancy or anything. I was turned down for the diocesan priesthood by my diocese. I'm going to say thank God. Life was kind of an agony, because it's like every morning I'd wake up and, okay, God, don't you have something you want me to do? What am I supposed to do today? And then I was asked, I was involved in the charismatic prayer group, and the priest who led the charismatic prayer group suggested I give a talk. That talk happened to be on the Feast of John the Baptist. So this thing flooded into my mind, this picture of John the Baptist at the juncture of Judaism and Christianity, right? Kind of like the last Jewish prophet and the first Christian saint in some sense, right? Because he was sanctified, leaving aside the Blessed Virgin Mary, he was sanctified in his mother's womb, right? In contact with Jesus. And so I kind of saw him as this fulcrum. So I wrote this, I prepared this talk for the prayer group. And then like I went to Mass, maybe a few days later. I go to Mass every morning. It's about an hour from my house, so there's an hour drive each way. And on the drive back, all these other pictures of like the juncture between Judaism and Christianity flooded into my head, actually so dramatically that I had to pull over. It's a highway, so I had to pull over on the side of the highway and kind of wait for the inspiration to pass before I could continue driving. And then I got home and I felt I should write down that, I don't want to call it a vision, but whatever you call it, that stream, intellectual stream that had flooded into me. And so I wrote it down, and it was just kind of this little piece of the puzzle, piece of the story of Judaism and Christianity. And it kept happening. It happened like day after day after day, that at Mass I would have these they're almost like intellectual visions, these pictures of things. And I would go home and I'd spend the rest of the day writing them down. I didn't know what I was doing. I thought these might be articles someday or something. And sometimes it would take me a few days to write, but as soon as I had finished writing one, the next one would come. And at a certain point, I realized if I put this here, and if I put this here, and if I put this here, I have the role of Judaism and salvation history from Abraham to the Second Coming. In other words, if I arrange them chronologically, I have the whole picture. Very often when I would be writing, I would have my eyes glued to the computer screen to read what I was writing because I had no idea where I was going with a sentence. I'd be halfway through a sentence and, be spellbound, like, oh, what's going to come next? What's the point of this? Where is it going? When I was doing research, like research on the occult roots of the Third Reich, stuff would just come to me. Like I'd be burned out writing, and I'd flick on the television, and there would be some stupid documentary, and it would have a critical piece of the puzzle, a critical fact I was looking for. I remember there was once, you all know what Google is, right? There was one point where I was looking for a fact, and I probably spent about 2 or 3 days trying to find this fact, and I couldn't find it, and I gave up, and went on to another chapter of the book. And then I was Googling something else for that other chapter. I misspelled the word, and what I had needed before popped up. I mean, it was just absolutely amazing. So that book, Salvation is from the Jews, from the beginning to end, from when I sat down to write it to when I was finished, was only about 5 months. And, which is pretty incredible. It's got like 400 footnotes, and
It's pure inspiration, wasn't
there was a lot of inspiration to it. And then when I finished writing it, I mean, I have no credentials, right? All my credentials are Harvard Business School, which isn't exactly theology. And when I was writing this, I never thought anyone would publish it. I never thought it would leave my computer. I thought it would just sit on my computer. But when I finished it, I printed out the text, the Word document. I put it in an envelope, put a stamp on it, and mailed it to Ignatius Press, which is the #1 Catholic publisher in the United States. It's the sole publisher of the Holy Father's books, And I just put it in the mail and sent it to them. And the fact that they decided to publish it is in itself a miracle, frankly. And so that's where that came from. And then when that book was published, that started everything else. Then I was asked on to EWTN, and then when I talked on EWTN, people started asking me to speak and so forth. So that's it. But I don't even feel like I wrote the book. And every time I read the book, I learn something new. So, if there aren't, if there are any other questions, I'm happy. Otherwise, I'll talk about something else. Yeah.
With Islam, there are a lot of little bits of information that have been, I think, inspired, such as the development of the baby in the womb and things like that. Are they diabolically inspired? Those kind of bits of information that was unknown at the time it was.
I don't think so. I mean, in other words, wherever. Oh boy, I was kind of thinking maybe I would avoid going back to this. No, I don't think the idea that the angel Gabriel, essentially, the idea that whatever spirit appeared to Muhammad and gave him the Quran was demonic. I don't think that means that everything in Islam is incorrect or wrong or destructive. And I think, in fact, that in general, the way the adversary works is he actually puts in as much truth as possible. You see that in occultism, by the way. You see that in the New Age. There's a lot of truth in it.
You see it with the false prophets.
You see it in the false prophets. He will, because people aren't dumb. He will put in, a good chunk of stuff that is true, and also there are other sources for things to flow in. But if something really comes from him, if it's his intention, then he will put in something, which is enough to, lead people in the wrong direction. Obviously, lead them to where he wants to go. He wants them to go. Now, maybe I will talk about that. But let me, before I talk any more about Islam, say I want to be sensitive. If the idea of what I said bothers somebody and they want to push back or they want to, kind of put me on the hot seat about it, I actually invite them to do it. I don't want to be getting away with anything. So, is anybody uncomfortable in a way that makes them want to challenge me? Yeah?
I find it difficult to, I accept, I suppose, because the church talks about the devil and so on, it's in the Bible. But I feel that human nature as it is, you don't need a devil, with fallen human nature. So I see problems in the world coming from, issues about human nature rather than the devil intervening. Do you see what I mean?
Does the devil exist? Do you think the devil exists?
Yes and no. Yes and no. Yes and no. I find it much easier to believe that it's human nature that causes problems because of who we are, because of our fallen.
I don't contest that. I don't contest that human nature causes an awful lot of problems. But I will argue that in some sense either the devil exists or he doesn't. I'm not insisting that you believe he exists, but it's either one or the other. He can't kind of like half exist, right? And if he exists, frankly, I wish he had gone into retirement, but I don't think he has. And I'm tempted to say, I know that not everyone can be present at an exorcism, but if one were ever present at basically a demonic manifestation, like what takes place at an exorcism, or read the account of very, very legitimate, very sober priests who are exorcists, and the fact that the devil, in a very direct way, is sometimes present in human behavior, I think is inescapable. And the exorcist for the Diocese of Westminster, I think I'm allowed, yeah, of course, he wrote that book. Yeah. Father Jeremy Davies, he was a psychiatrist, and before he got his vocation as a priest. And they made him an exorcist precisely because as a psychiatrist, he was particularly able to discriminate, between psychological manifestations, or various things that were of human origin, and things which were genuine, diabolical or demonic manifestations. And exorcists are, they're the most level-headed, no-nonsense, calm, undramatic, people that I know. They tend to remind me of like plumbers or something, because they're so matter-of-fact and undramatic about things. And yet, yet these things are really happening. Obviously I respect everybody's, right to their view of things and so forth. But I think that, let me make an advertisement for something else. Whether one, of course, I think it's a very appropriate position to take, to remain unconvinced until one becomes convinced, right? You shouldn't be convinced of something because I say it or because someone else says it, but somehow because the aggregate body of evidence convinces one. And there is a historian named Warren Carroll who wrote a number of books. Has anyone heard of him? He's really good. He wrote a book called The Cross and the Guillotine, which is a history of the French Revolution. And it describes, historically, the Masonic influence and essentially the satanic, the role of satanic brotherhoods in the French Revolution. And if you read about the French Revolution, I don't see, that looks very much like a diabolical action, because the number one target of the French Revolution was the church, right? They changed the week by law to 10 days so that no one could observe Sunday because they couldn't know what Sunday was because the week was 10 days. They intentionally desecrated churches with horrible blasphemous acts because, and by the way, they guillotined a lot of priests and religious, but they had too many for the guillotine, so they had what they called noyades or drownings, where they would pack them onto barges and tow the barges out into the middle of the river and sink the barges, so they would drown. This wasn't a political action. It wasn't primarily a political action. It's kind of inexplicable without seeing it as an interplay between basically an expression of the devil working through people to bring about some kind of large-scale social action. He wrote a book on the Bolshevik Revolution called White Mantle, Red Banner, which is really, I mean, again, the Bolshevik Revolution is really interesting to see it from a spiritual perspective, or to see the history illumined from a spiritual perspective, because you had the Tsar essentially being the head of the Russian Orthodox Church and being this figurehead of Christianity. Then you had the Tsar and the Tsarina getting very deeply involved in the occult, and then bringing in Rasputin. You've heard of Rasputin, right?
Yeah.
Who was, I mean, I don't know how to put it. He had to be an occultist because otherwise he was superhuman or immortal or whatever. And you see that this, I don't know how to put it, but you see the kind of the demonic in almost an overt way taking over the head or the figurehead of the Russian church, and then falling to the Bolsheviks, who were totally anti-God and wanted to stamp out God, right? Why would they? Anyway, so he also wrote another one, by the way, about the Our Lady of the Virgin of Guadalupe and the conquest of the Aztecs. So I guess what I'm saying is I think the evidence is on the side of a spiritual view of history, and obviously I tried to paint that this afternoon with the Holocaust, a kind of spiritual view of history. And by the way, I'll actually throw that in as evidence too. Secularists, including most Jews, when they look at the Holocaust, they're left saying, how can human beings behave this way? And you can talk about fallen human nature, but it's a stretch to think of normal human beings. The head of the Auschwitz camp, who was also called Hess, but he's not the famous Hess, but he was another Hess. He took his family to Mass every Sunday. He was a really good family man. He saw himself as a serious Catholic, and yet, his house, with the ideal little garden and the blonde wife and the blonde-haired little kids, was on the grounds of Auschwitz, where he was running Auschwitz. I mean, how is that within just fallen human nature to have such a bizarre kind of manifestation of evil and kind of unconsciousness of evil? I think the spiritual explanation holds a lot more water.
But there would be no point for the sacraments of confession if there was no devil. And confession is the greatest form of exorcism. And I work very close with exorcist priests. That's my ministry. And if you hear what those priests have to say, there would be no point in the crucifixion. We could cancel Good Friday if there was no devil. The sacraments are there to keep the devil at bay. And that's why we have to go to regular confession to silence the devil in our consciences.
Brandon? Okay, I mean really, but I'm not that I disagree, but I want to have a little gentler touch than that.
Yeah, but I'm very zealous about that.
I appreciate that. Let me just finish that about Hess. Hess converted when he was arrested he was held for a Nuremberg trial, and he was executed. But while he was in prison awaiting execution, he had a reversion or conversion, and he wrote a very beautiful letter to his wife saying, I don't understand how I could have been so blind. This is terrible what I did. The only right thing is for me to be executed. And this beautiful letter of repentance and apology. So grace was at work too. But anyway, I don't know what to say, but thank you for being honest about that. And I don't want to try to make anyone believe anything that they don't come to on their own.
Our Lady will crush its head. It's referring to Satan, isn't it?
It's hard, but it's hard. I mean, it's hard. Somebody asked me, actually, you were talking earlier about whether Jews believe in the devil. It's a terribly anti-spiritual culture. And that in most, circles or most places, you show up at work. If people thought you believed in the person of the devil, they would think you were nuts. And I don't remember who it was, but somebody I remember and I think it was somebody high up in the church, said that the devil's greatest victory has been convincing people that he doesn't exist. Does anyone know what that quote is from? Who? Is it? Okay, who does know the quote?
It has changed through the Catholic Church. When I was a child, we were brought up with the devil. It's never hardly mentioned now.
Yeah. By the way, one of the things that you see, I'm just giving a little pitch for sacramentals too, like holy water and medals and so forth. And one of the tests that exorcists use to see if somebody is really, whether it's really a demonic influence or whether it's just psychology, is they use the sacramentals. And if the person is really in a state of possession, they'll go nuts, if holy water is around, or if a crucifix is around, or in the presence of a blessed medal. Whereas, obviously, it may not even be visible, and yet the demon will respond violently in the presence of a sacramental.
And Padre Pio and the Curia Vars.
The Curia Vars was really tormented, wasn't it?
Yeah, they have to.
Oh yeah, that's true. If you visit Ars, the rectory, they preserved his bed, which is half burned, right?
Benedict.
Yeah. Anyway, on to cheerier topics, maybe.
Just when we were talking yesterday about hatred without cause, it made me think the terminology, the way the words were framed, that hatred with cause, with just cause, is allowed within the Jewish faith. Is that right? Or?
Oh, hatred with just cause is allowed in the Jewish faith. Yeah, I would have to say that the teaching, remember when Jesus said, you have heard it said that you should love your friends and hate your enemies, but I tell you, love your enemies. He was basically, right, he was quoting Jewish scripture, that it is, this idea of loving your enemies is really an introduction of Christianity. It is I don't know how to put it, but it's an elevation of the state of man that came with Christ. And in the Old Testament, there isn't that sense. There is a sense, first of all, there's a sense of righteous anger, righteous hatred. One of my favorite Old Testament heroes is Phineas. Does anyone know Phineas? Phineas, when the Jews were in the desert, they had the Ark of the Covenant in a tent, right, in the center of the camp. And the Israelites were firmly forbidden from having any relations with pagan women, right? And this Israelite man was having relations with a pagan woman within sight of the Ark of the Covenant, within sight of the tent of meeting. And Phineas took his spear and drove it through the two of them with one blow. And did God punish him? No. God rewarded him by making the priesthood his descendants. In other words, said essentially, because what you've done is so great. He was a son of Aaron. So, and God said, from now on, the priestly line will flow through your line as a reward for this great act of righteous indignation that you did.
It's just Christians. I find it hard the Old Testament always have had because of the destruction of every man, woman and child.
Yeah.
The Old Testament's all about wiping out your enemy. From that. And Jesus comes and teaches a new thing. The reason I'm asking the question is that still the way? I'm trying to understand the Middle East. And is it still, destruction of your enemy? Is that still the thinking?
I don't think, the short answer is, I don't think that is the Jewish view of things. I think that they go to great lengths in Jewish theology to kind of explain, I don't know how to put it, they wrestle with it. I mean, Christians accept the Old Testament too, right? So Christianity has to wrestle with what was God thinking of when he said, wipe out every man, woman, and child. And just like Christians have to wrestle with that and try to, I don't want to say, almost like make up excuses for God or try to work around that. That's basically this takes place in Judaism also. But at the same time, they don't of course have the benefit the example of Jesus on the cross saying, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. So they don't have actually the ultimate key to that. There was a heresy, Marcionism. There was a heretic, Marcion, I don't know what he was, 2nd, 3rd century, who basically said that a God of the Old Testament wasn't God, and that the Old Testament were spurious scriptures. Actually, he basically put the Old Testament in the category that I put the Quran in. And anyway, that was declared a heresy, officially by the church and so forth. And if that hadn't happened, I would be sympathetic with him, basically. That's what I'm saying. I mean, in other words, I know that everything in the Old Testament happened, and that the God in the Old Testament was the God who appears in the Old Testament because the church tells me so, and because it's dogma. But if it weren't, I would definitely have a lot of trouble figuring out how it could be the case.
I find with the Old Testament, particularly the prophets, Isaiah, the mirror of the New Testament, the foretelling of everything that was going to happen to Christ.
Yeah, that was true. And Isaiah is called the proto-evangelist, right? Like he's a 5th evangelist because he's almost like an evangelist. And it's true. It's very, it has a feel very much like the New Testament. And it does, I don't want to say perfectly, but really, really dramatically and beautifully portray Christ. And in fact, as a result of that, the Jews pay very little attention to it. The Jewish scripture is divided into 3 categories: the law, the writings, and the prophets. And in fact, you see Jesus saying that. He says, you search the law and the prophets, I think he says at one point. And the law is the first 5 books of Moses, the Torah, which was supposedly given by God to Moses on Mount Sinai. The prophets are the prophets, and the writings are essentially the wisdom books, the books like Ecclesiastes and Wisdom and so forth. And basically, Jewish education pays 99% of the attention to the Torah, to the first 5 books, and very little to the writings and the prophets. And I think that is in part because the prophets start to sometimes smell a little bit of Christianity. And there is a cycle of readings. The Mass in many ways mirrors the Jewish synagogue liturgy. And just like at Mass, you have what used to be the epistle and the gospel. Now I guess it's the first reading and the gospel. In the Jewish synagogue service, you have it's called a reading from the Haftorah, but you have a reading from the prophets, and then you have a reading from the Torah, from the first 5 books. And there's a cycle of readings for the prophets, and that cycle of readings leaves out those passages. They never appear like the suffering servant passage and so forth. So, obviously that may not be coincidental. It may be because there are passages in the prophets that lead one inevitably to think of Jesus. This is a little bit of just reminded me more than being an answer to your question. But the question sometimes people ask is, what do Jews do with the passages that so clearly portray a picture of the crucifixion and of Jesus and so forth? And there are a number of answers to that. One is, I'll basically tell you what a Jewish anti-missionary would answer to these various things. So you say to a Jewish anti-missionary, look, Jesus fulfilled 453 messianic prophecies in the Old Testament. How could he not be the Messiah? And the answer is, of course he fulfilled 453 messianic prophecies because he was made up. He was a fiction. The Gospels are a fiction, and he was made up to fit those prophecies. Okay? So that's one answer. Of course, the rebuttal to that is that the Gospels can't have been made up because they were circulated in the lifetime of people who lived around Jesus. And so if they were made up, people would know it. What? Yeah, the Gospels were written, I talked about this before, but the first Gospel had to be written in the 60s. So only about 30 years after the crucifixion. And if it was all made up, people would have known that it was all made
The
up.
thing is that whatever's written in the old law is actually the same in the new law. In the New Testament. It's the same thing taken in from the Old Testament to the New Testament.
Well, it's kind of transformed, right?
Yeah, well,
I mean, to love your enemies, for instance, if somebody takes your, forces you to, conscripts you for a mile, go 2 miles, and if they take your, coat, give them your shirt also, that is not.
No, and we're told that Jesus came to give us a new order, didn't he?
Well, to kind of, oh boy, this is probably beyond my depth, but to fulfill the old law and to bring it to its perfection, to bring it to a higher state that it was always intended for, I think. And if you read the Sermon on the Mount, right, he keeps going back to the old law and then kind of, like exalting it or elevating it. The other thing that Jewish anti-missionaries do is that some of the passages that are most resonant with Jesus, like they pierced my hands and my feet, they have a different, it's called textual variant. Obviously the Old Testament is handwritten, since there was no alternative until Gutenberg, and it's written on parchment, and those scrolls last maybe 200 years. So actually, in general 200 years, they may occasionally last more than that. So they have to be rewritten periodically. And over the course of the centuries, as they get rewritten, occasional very small differences creep into the text. And those are called textual variants. And the textual variant that the Christian Old Testament is based on has essentially the word "they pierced" there. The textual variant that the Jewish Old Testament is based on has "like a lion." And the difference is Hebrew has 2 letters. One is a yud, which is a little hook with a short tail, and one is a vav, which is a little hook with a long tail. And if it had the short tail, it would be like a lion, and if it had a long tail, it would be they pierced. So it's a very easy kind of error to creep in. Now, Christian apologists say the Jews cheated and changed it. Jewish apologists say the Christians cheated and changed it. But obviously, or it was an innocent error, I suppose, is another possibility. But what's really neat about that is, remember where Jesus says not a jot or a tittle will be changed, and it's like that's like a jot or a tittle. That's the smallest possible mark that's changed there. And the word that's generally translated "they pierced," this is another argument that Jewish apologists make, is that's not really they pierced. The word is dug, like to dig a well. And so it's not really they pierced my hands and my feet, it's like they dug a well in my hands and my feet. And the Jewish apologists will say, see, that's the Christians cheating and trying to change things. But it's very beautiful to think, since it's, Jesus is saving blood, right, which poured out of his 5 wounds and saved us. So if those are wells from which spring, life eternal, that's kind of a very appropriate image to have. Anything else?
You go and talk to Jews about...
I would, but they don't invite me.
You've never been asked?
What?
You've never been asked?
Oh no, I've never been asked. I've never been asked. I've never been asked. My book hasn't been reviewed in any Jewish reviews or magazines, and I had it sent to all of them. So no, I do get Jews occasionally to my talks. Usually they're dragged along by their Catholic wives. And I've had some very beautiful experiences of Jews who have entered the Catholic Church after either hearing a talk of mine or reading my book. But I'm anathema. I'm really anathema to
do you think that
Jewish
would
groups.
change? Do you foresee that would change?
No, why would it change?
From what you say, though, that before the second coming.
Oh, it'll change as the Jews convert.
Yeah.
But that's right. But I mean, Jewish groups which are Jewish per se,
Alright.
the
If
worst thing in the
individual-
world
if
is conversion to Christianity, is apostasy. And so, they'll never want to hear the other side.
Because we're called individually anyway, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right,
Jesus
that's
called
right.
by-
And that's the way the Holy Spirit works, right? Is in
I
the
missed your
individual.
talk this morning, so you might have mentioned it, but my daughter-in-law was Jewish and she became a Catholic. And her father, who was a very eminent Harley Street specialist, stood on the synagogue steps and tore his clothes. I have no daughter.
Yeah.
That's about 4 or 5 years ago, yeah.
Yeah, that's.
I married a Protestant and we had pretty much the same problem.
There's been some, it's been some kind of, I don't know, heavy or dark stuff that came up. So anyway, I'm saying, if there are any more questions, I'm happy to take them. Otherwise, I think I'll read some more from Jewish converts to kind of make things a little bit sunnier again.
Just one,
Another dark comment.
because I'm curious. I'm a curious person. Have you had more visits from Our Lady?
Have I
When
had
you
more
dream
visits from
from-
Our Lady? The first few years of my conversion, I had a ridiculously active prayer life, a spiritual life, and I thought it was normal. And I had lots of really neat things happen. But that decreased pretty steadily over time. And so I don't expect ever to have anything really like that, although I will, in another kind of way, argue that, whenever one is at, a Marian shrine or on retreat and is, filled, with the supernatural love of God, right? That's really a miraculous grace. People go to, Marian apparition sites, or they go to Medjugorje or whatever, and they're just walking on air, for 3 or 4 days. That's a miraculous supernatural grace. You receive communion, or sometimes people receive communion, and they're just like shaking inside with joy, and that's a supernatural grace. And those are graces that, I don't know, Catholics may be kind of spoiled because they may actually kind of take them for granted. I mean, even saying the rosary and getting, kind of filled with this sleepy peace, that's all really miraculous and supernatural. So I guess what I'm saying is I have the normal, miraculous, supernatural Catholic stuff. Okay, let me read some more unnormal, supernatural, miraculous stuff. Because let me just kind of introduce this by saying one of the women, I don't think she's here anymore, but she was here this morning and had to leave, said after my talk this morning that cradle Catholics can be kind of oblivious to what they have because they grew up with it. And it's one of the reasons it's a great privilege to talk to Catholic groups, because the picture that I have in my mind is it's as though, we grow up in England or the United States and we have electric light and we have running water and we have central heating, and if you want to drink the water you turn a tap, and you walk in a dark room, you push a button on the wall. But imagine an African tribesman, right, who grows up in the bush, and they come to this country and they're just in astonishment, right? Their jaws hang down to their chest for 3 weeks at amazement that, you don't have to walk 10 miles to get a drink of water, you just turn a knob and so forth. And that to me is the situation that cradle Catholics are in. They have so much in the sacraments, and they have so much in the teaching of the church, that they're like we are with respect to electric lights and indoor plumbing and so forth. And when you come in from outside, it's just absolutely overwhelming. I never even hope to have the answers which are all there in the Penny Catechism. All right? In other words, I thought my fondest dream would be to have 1/10 of those straight answers, about the meaning of life and what happens after you die and how you're supposed to live and so forth. It's all there in, simple, black and white. The sacraments, the living living with the Blessed Mother. I mean, it's just overwhelming. I don't know how to put it, but it's like when you're in the Catholic Church, you are not you're not in exile on earth. You're not stranded on earth. You're actually have this I don't know how to put it elevator to heaven that you live with, and other people don't have it, and that's the real reason to evangelize is because everybody who doesn't have what you have as Catholics is actually condemned to a state of misery. And why, this is like a little bit of an overstatement, but I'm tempted to say, why are all those young people on drugs, Because they are looking for what they would have to be in a state of grace in the Catholic Church to have. They're looking for the answers, they're looking for the meaning of life, they're looking to be out of this life and in some sort of supernatural experience, and it's all what we have, and we're going to be called to account when we come to judgment. I suspect we're not only going to be called to account for the personal morality of our behavior, but we're also going to be called to account for how much we spread the wealth. I know, it's scary, right? The curé of Ars said that he'd be the happiest man on earth if he wasn't a pastor and knew what he would be responsible for, right, when he went to judgment. And thank God we're not pastors or bishops, so we're not going to be responsible for huge flocks. But that person who you don't evangelize, or you don't open your heart a little bit to and kind of share the faith with, you may be the only person on their path until they die who was in a position to bring them to God. It's pretty scary, huh? That's why you're grinning, because you're too scared to. Anyway, it's a privilege to try to kind of to come in from the outside. And like I said, I was filled with furious indignation that no one had told me about Fatima, right? How can you be keeping this a secret? So anyway, let me read a couple of these passages which kind of demonstrate, these are extraordinary graces, I must admit, but there's an echo with ordinary graces. I told the story for Herman Cohen this morning. I'm not going to tell the story again, but I'll read his words about his experience, when he was in front of the Blessed Sacrament. Without any participation of my will, I was forced despite myself to bow down. I felt a great weight that descended over my whole body, forcing me to bow, even to prostrate myself despite myself. The Blessed Sacrament was exposed, and I'm skipping obviously. The Blessed Sacrament was exposed, and as soon as I saw it, I was drawn to the altar rail and fell to my knees. This time, at the moment of benediction, it was easy for me to bow down, and getting up again, I felt a very sweet peace in my whole being. I burned with impatience to be at more masses. And then the next time it happened, at the moment of elevation, all of a sudden I felt burst forth behind my eyelids a flood of tears that did not cease to flow with voluptuous abundance down my inflamed cheeks. I had you there present in my spirit with all the celestial sensations that you brought down from on high, and gratitude for the enormity of the blessings that God was flooding me with filled me. I remember having cried a few times as a child, but never did I know such tears. I felt surge up from the depths of my chest, split open by my conscience, the most tearing remorse over my entire past life. All of a sudden and spontaneously, as though by intuition, I offered God a general confession, interior and rapid, of all of my enormous sins since childhood. Hideous, repulsive, revolting, deserving all the anger of a sovereign judge. And yet, I also felt an unknown peace that soon spread over my entire soul, like a soothing balm, that the God of mercy would forgive me these, that he would turn away his gaze from my crimes, that he would take pity on my sincere contrition, on my bitter sorrow. Yes, I felt that he would give me grace, and that he would accept in expiation my firm resolution to love him above all else, and to turn to him from then on. When I left the church, I was already a Christian, as much a Christian as is possible to be before baptism. Then let me read what happened at his baptism when the water was put over him. The earth disappeared. The priest holding the shell with holy water was no longer a man. God had promised to descend himself in that moment and take possession. When the holy water touched my forehead, all of a sudden my body shook, and I felt such a violent, powerful movement that I can only compare to an electric shock. The eyes of my soul opened to a supernatural and divine light. This light expanded in my whole being. God, the Holy Spirit, as though to seal his promise, descended from the heights of heaven to me, taking me by the hand and showing me in ecstasy, which a finite being could never comprehend, the infinite. Yes, I saw the eyes of my body closed, but those of my soul wide open with joy, in immense brilliance without end. That soared, plunged ever further, never meeting an obstacle. Everywhere myriads of angels sang with an indescribable beauty, ever more beautiful, ever more ravishing, such as no human ear ever heard, and the heavenly sense. And a soft warmth penetrated me, and my sight, despite the dazzling light that shone everywhere, never stopped plunging into the rays, and in the center reigned a light even more brilliant in its whiteness. There, sitting on a glorious throne, with on his right his glorious, well-beloved mother, was our Lord Jesus Christ, beautiful with an eternal youthfulness, and at his feet, all around him, the army of saints, clothed in the most brilliant colors of the rainbow. These saints were prostrate at the foot of the throne, adoring him, and yet at the same time they turned and looked at me with sweet smiles of welcome. All of heaven and its inhabitants seemed to be rejoicing at my baptism, as though the poor small soul of a redeemed sinner could hold real weight in the scales of eternity. Isn't that beautiful? And that's baptism, right? And that's the story. I mean, we don't get to see it, but that's the story. I mean, that's the story of anybody who is baptized, is saved. The only other one from here that I really want to talk about a little bit and read a passage from is Alphonse Ratisbonne. And there are a couple of reasons why I wanted to talk about him. One is that he was the founder of that order in the Holy Land who prayed for the conversion of the Jews. Another is that the apparition of the Blessed Virgin Mary that converted him is the only, to this day, church-approved apparition of the Blessed Virgin Mary in Rome, in the city of Rome. I think it was about 1842 that it happened. Alphonse Ratisbonne, no, I don't have him actually. I don't have a card dedicated to him. But he was an aristocratic Jew from France, from Strasbourg, born into a banking family. His uncle, he was orphaned as a child and raised by an uncle who owned one of the, real Jewish banking networks, right? Banks in France. And he doted on Alphonse, and he actually made him a partner, promised him a partnership in the bank when he was, I think it was 26 at the time. So this happened when he was about 26. He had just been given this partnership in the bank. He had just gotten engaged to the love of his life, who was actually a cousin of his, and he was very much in love with her, and she was apparently a really wonderful girl. And he was very anti-Catholic, very anti-Catholic. He hated the Catholic Church with a passion. He couldn't, stand seeing the sight of a cassock walk down the street, without being totally revolted and disgusted. He was full of all kinds of blasphemies against the Catholic Church. He was engaged to his cousin, who was only 16, so because she was too young for the marriage, he decided to take a world tour for a year until she was 17, and then they would get married. On this world tour, he started out going through Italy. I'll cut to the chase. I can't get, the whole story. He was in Rome. When he was in Rome, he ran into the brother of a school friend of his who was Catholic, who was a devout Catholic, who offered to show Alphonse around Rome. Alphonse spent the whole time that they were showing, of course when you get shown around Rome, a lot of what you see are religious things, right? Our churches and catacombs and the Vatican and stuff like that. Alphonse was just full of blasphemies. Horrible blasphemies about the holy stairs and so forth. Kind of mocking and trying to make his friend mad, but his friend didn't get mad. And at one point, they're over at his friend's house in the evening, and his friend says, well, since you think this is all nonsense, then you won't mind doing this little bet. Wear the miraculous medal around your neck for a month, and every night say the Memorare. Remember Almost Blessed Virgin Mary. And Alphonse said, oh no, I won't touch that, no way. And the friend said, well, then you must take it seriously, right? Because it's all nonsense. You would do it just to humor me, to show me that's all nonsense, right? So his friend succeeded and got Alphonse to wear the miraculous medal and to say the Memorare every day. And it was only a few days later, his friend was driving him around Rome. His friend had to stop in a church to make some funeral arrangements. The church is San Andrea della Frada, which is, I'm forgetting the landmarks in Rome, but it's
near the Spanish Steps.
It's near the Spanish Steps, right? It's almost in the shadow of the pillar to the Immaculate Conception. And when his friend went into the sacristy to make the arrangements, Alphonse Ratisbonne just waited in the church. And I'm tempted to say, I'll just go to his words then. But the church disappeared from in front of him, and he was sitting actually in front of an altar in a side chapel to St. Michael, the Archangel, and the Blessed Virgin Mary appeared in front of him as she appears on the miraculous medal, with her hands down like this. And let me just see if I can find the relevant passages. I had only been in the church a moment when I was suddenly seized with an indescribable agitation of mind. I looked up and found that the rest of the building had disappeared. One single chapel seemed to have gathered all the light and concentrated it in itself. In the midst of this radiance, I saw someone standing on the altar, a lofty, shining figure, all majesty and sweetness, the Virgin Mary, just as she looks on this medal. Some irresistible force drew me toward her. She motioned me to kneel down, and when I did so, she seemed to approve. Though she never said a word, I understood her perfectly. 3 times I tried to look up to her, and 3 times I found myself unable to raise my eyes higher than her hands, from which blessings and gracings seemed to fall like so many shining rays. "O God," I cried, "only half an hour before I was blaspheming and felt a deadly hatred for the Catholic religion. All my acquaintances know that, humanly speaking, I have the strongest reasons for remaining a Jew. My family is Jewish, my bride-to-be is a Jewish, my uncle is a Jew. By becoming a Catholic, I am sacrificing all my earthly hopes and interests, and yet I am not mad." If anyone had approached me and said, "Alphonse, in 15 minutes you will be adoring Jesus Christ, your God and your Savior. You will be prostrate in a poor church, and you will throw yourself at the feet of a priest in a Jesuit convent where you will be spending carnival preparing for baptism, ready to be a holocaust for the Catholic faith. You will renounce the world with its pomps and its pleasures. You will renounce your riches, your hopes, and your own future. And if necessary, you will further renounce your fiancé, the love of your family, the esteem of your friends, your association with other Jews, and you will wish for no more than to follow Jesus Christ and to carry his cross until death. I say that if some prophet had made such a prediction, I would have thought that the only man in the world crazier than he was would be the only one who believed such an insanity. Yet it is precisely this insanity that today is my wisdom and my happiness." And let me read how he described his inner experience when the Blessed Virgin Mary appeared before him. "I didn't know where I was. I didn't know whether I was Alphonse or someone else. I felt so entirely changed that I thought I was another self. I tried to find myself and couldn't. The most intense joy burst in the depths of my soul. I was unable to speak. All that I can say is that in a moment, the blindfold dropped from my eyes, not only a single blindfold, but a whole slew of blindfolds that had enveloped me disappeared rapidly, one after the other, as snow and fog and ice disappear under the influence of the burning sun. I climbed out of a tomb, an abyss of shadows, and I was alive, perfectly alive. But I wept. I saw at the bottom of the abyss the extreme misery from which I had been pulled by an infinite mercy. I shuddered at the sight of all of my iniquities, and I was stupefied, moved to compassion, crushed with admiration and gratitude. But tears of pity mingled with my tears of love. Alas, so many men went calmly down into that pit, blinded by pride or indifference. They descended there to be swallowed alive in the horrible shadows. Oh, I was torn apart with anxiety. Will you not raise your eyes to the Savior of the world, whose blood erased the stain of original sin? Oh, how hideous is the imprint of that stain. It renders completely unrecognizable the creature made in the image of God. Right? That's the story. That's the story of baptism. That's the story of the Catholic faith. That's the story of the fate of those out there who, who sounds corny, who need to be rescued.
Is there any conversion of the Jews where Our Lady wasn't involved?
Where what? Our Lady wasn't involved. Well, Herman Cohen, it was the Blessed Sacrament, right? And Charlie Rich, it was Jesus speaking to him when he was looking at the picture. But I know in my case, and therefore by extension I think in the case of many of these others, the Blessed Virgin Mary is less threatening. And it's true. I mean, Jesus, I'm sorry to kind of, confess this, but, Jesus is the crucifix, Jesus is the Crusades, Jesus is the Inquisition. I mean, I know he isn't, but, there are all these images with, that are associated with Jesus, but none of them are associated with the Blessed Virgin Mary.